London, 1854. The morning mist still hung over the cobblestone streets like a ghostly veil when Eleanor Ashford awoke with a familiar weight of resignation pressing against her chest. At 34 years old, she had become what Victorian society considered not merely an anomaly, but almost an aberration, a spinster who had long surpassed the appropriate age for marriage. While young ladies of 15 to 21 were displayed like precious commodities in glittering ballrooms, their futures bright with possibility, Eleanor had become invisible, a shadow existing at the margins of real life, a cautionary tale whispered behind fans and over teacups. Her mother had passed away 3 years prior, taking with her the last hopes that Eleanor might still find a husband. "You were always so particular, my daughter," her mother had said on her deathbed, her voice weak but laden with disappointment that cut deeper than any blade. "You refused Mr. Pemberton when you were 20 because he was dull. You dismissed the vicar at 23 because you felt no spark. You waited for love, for passion, for something more than comfortable companionship. And now it is too late." The words had embedded themselves in Eleanor's heart like thorns that never fully healed, festering wounds that reopened with each passing birthday, each pitying glance, each whispered comment about her unmarried state. Now she lived under the roof of her uncle Cornelius Ashford, a prosperous businessman with no patience for what he considered sentimental weaknesses. He was a man who measured everything by its practical value, and in his ledger, Eleanor represented nothing but deficit. He tolerated her because his sister, Eleanor's mother, had requested it in her will, but he made it clear, in every cold glance and every cutting remark during dinners, that Eleanor was a burden he bore with growing resentment. Another mouth to feed, she had heard him tell his wife one evening when he thought Eleanor had retired to her room. And for what purpose? "She is past her prime, past any reasonable hope. No sensible man will look at her twice. She should be grateful we provide her with shelter and food, though God knows what she does to earn her keep." His wife, Aunt Margaret, had replied in a voice that dripped with false sympathy. "Perhaps we could find her a position as a governess, Cornelius. Surely her education could be put to some use. It seems wasteful to simply house her when she could be earning her own way." The conversation had continued, discussing Eleanor as if she were a problematic piece of furniture that needed to be disposed of, and she had stood frozen in the hallway, her hand on the banister, feeling her value as a human being diminish with every word. If you're beginning to feel Eleanor's loneliness, leave a comment sharing if you've ever felt invisible at some point in your life. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this unexpected journey. Eleanor had learned not to cry anymore. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford, a weakness that would only confirm what everyone already believed about spinsters, that they were bitter, emotional creatures who had failed at the most basic duty of womanhood. She had learned to occupy the corners of rooms, to fade into wallpaper and shadows, to smile politely when they asked, with that cruel pity that masqueraded as concern, whether she had considered becoming a governess or a lady's companion. "After all, Miss Ashford, a woman of your age must be practical," Lady Pemberton had said just last week, her voice carrying across the drawing room where Eleanor had been serving tea to her cousin Caroline's guests. The smile Lady Pemberton offered didn't reach her eyes. "There is no time left for romantic fantasies. You must think of your future, of how you will support yourself when your uncle, well, when circumstances change." The implication was clear. When Uncle Cornelius died, Eleanor would be without protection, without home, without prospects. She would be dependent on the grudging charity of distant relatives or forced into the degrading position of seeking employment. At 34, she was too old to be desirable as a governess. Families wanted young, energetic women who could keep up with boisterous children. She was too educated to be a mere servant, yet too unmarried and poor to maintain any social standing. She existed in a liminal space, belonging nowhere, wanted by no one. But the worst, the truly devastating moment that had nearly broken what remained of Eleanor's spirit, had happened 6 months earlier. Eleanor had been invited to tea at the Hartleys' home, or rather, her cousin Caroline had been invited and had brought Eleanor as companion, much as one might bring a shawl or a reticule, a necessary accessory without any intrinsic value. She was seated with other women in the elaborate rose and gold drawing room, surrounded by delicate porcelain figurines and silk cushions, pretending to be interested in their insipid conversation about the latest embroidery patterns and which shade of ribbon was most fashionable that season. The air was thick with perfume and the subtle undercurrent of competition that existed among society ladies, each trying to outdo the other with tales of their daughter's success or their own social triumphs. Eleanor had been holding a delicate teacup painted with roses, nodding at appropriate intervals, when she heard her name being mentioned in the adjacent room. The door between the rooms was slightly ajar, and voices carried clearly through the opening. That Ashford woman? The voice belonged to Lady Hartley, loud and clear, with no attempt to lower her volume. My dear, she is 34 years old. She may call herself Miss, but we all know she is a finished spinster, past any hope of redemption. I saw her uncle trying to introduce her to the Jenkins merchant's son last month. Jenkins, of all people, a man who smells of fish and commerce, and not even he showed the slightest interest. Can you imagine? When even a tradesman's son refuses you, what hope remains? The laughter that followed was like knives piercing Eleanor's chest. She remained motionless, frozen in her chair, the teacup trembling slightly in her hand, creating tiny ripples in the amber liquid. Around her, the other women in the drawing room had fallen silent, their eyes sliding toward her with a mixture of pity and embarrassment, but also with relief. Relief that they were not the subject of such ridicule, that their own daughters were younger, more desirable, more successful. It is sad, truly, another voice added, recognizable as that of Viscountess Whitmore, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper observations. But she can blame no one but herself. She was too demanding when young, too particular about her requirements. I remember when she refused Lord Ashby's nephew a perfectly respectable match because she claimed they had nothing in common. Nothing in common. As if that matters in marriage. Marriage is about duty, about family, about producing heirs. Romance is for novels, not real life. Precisely, Lady Hartley agreed. And now she is paying the price for her foolish romanticism. A woman of 34 years? She is practically in the grave already. Her childbearing years are nearly finished, if not already gone. And even if some desperate soul accepted her, perhaps a widower in need of a nursemaid for his existing children, what kind of wife would she be? The best years of fertility are gone. The doctors all agree that women past 30 face terrible dangers in childbirth. She probably could not even provide an heir without risking her life and the child's. What man would take such a risk? And her appearance, a third voice chimed in, younger and more spiteful. Eleanor recognized it as belonging to Miss Marianne Chester, a girl of barely 19 who had just become engaged to a viscount. She dresses like someone's maiden aunt, all gray and brown, with her hair pulled back so severely. She has given up entirely. At least if she tried to make herself more appealing. But no, she has accepted defeat. One can see it in her eyes. She knows she is unwanted, unnecessary, a burden on her family. Eleanor had remained in her seat for another excruciating 20 minutes, her face a mask of composure, while her insides churned with humiliation and pain. When Caroline finally indicated it was time to leave, Eleanor had risen with careful dignity, thanked Lady Hartley for the tea, meeting her eyes directly so the woman would know Eleanor had heard every word, and walked out with her head high. But that night, alone in her small bedroom in her uncle's house, she had buried her face in her pillow and sobbed until her throat was raw and her eyes swollen. Not because of the cruel words, those she already knew, had already internalized, had whispered to herself in dark moments, but because of the confirmation, the public declaration that no matter who she was inside, her sharp mind that could debate philosophy and politics, her kind heart that felt deeply for others, her soul that still hoped and dreamed and yearned, she had been reduced to a number, 34. And that number condemned her to irrelevance, to invisibility, to a life of dependence and pity. That October morning, 6 months after the Tea Party humiliation, Eleanor dressed with particular care, though she knew it would make little difference. She wore her gray dress, the color that had become her unofficial uniform, a shade that allowed her to blend into backgrounds and avoid attention. The dress was well made but several years old, the style slightly outdated, marking her as someone who could not afford to follow fashion's rapid changes. She pinned her chestnut hair into a severe chignon, though in her mirror she could still see that her hair remained thick and lustrous, with only a few silver threads beginning to appear at her temples. Her eyes, a deep hazel that changed with her mood in the light, looked tired but were still clear and intelligent. She was not, she knew objectively, ugly. But at 34 and unmarried, beauty was irrelevant. She might as well have been plain as a post for all the attention she received. The invitation to the Worthingtons' ball had been on her writing desk for a week, and she had stared at it each morning with a mixture of dread and resignation. She had only decided to accept because Caroline had insisted, had actually come to her room and sat on her bed with unusual earnestness. "Please, Eleanor," Caroline had said, gripping her hand. "I know these events are difficult for you, but I need you there. Mother is unwell and cannot attend, and Father insists I must have a chaperone. You know I cannot go alone, and if I do not attend, I will miss seeing Lord Pemberton, who has finally shown interest in me." Eleanor had wanted to refuse, to plea a headache or fatigue, but Caroline's eyes were so desperate, so full of the hope that Eleanor herself had once possessed, that she could not bring herself to disappoint her younger cousin. Caroline was 22, still well within the acceptable age for marriage, still the recipient of admiring glances and whispered compliments. Eleanor remembered being that age, remembered the thrill of preparation for balls, the flutter of excitement at the prospect of dancing, of conversation, of possibility. So she had agreed, and now she was preparing to endure another evening of being invisible, of standing against walls while others danced, of smiling pleasantly while matrons pitied her and young girls looked at her with fear, seeing in Eleanor their own potential future if they made wrong choices. The Worthington ballroom was an explosion of opulence that made one's eyes burn with the sheer excess of it all. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like imprisoned constellations, each prism refracting the light of hundreds of candles into dancing rainbows that painted the golden silk-lined walls with shifting patterns of color. The floor was polished marble, imported from Italy at enormous expense, so smooth and reflective that the dancers seemed to float above their own mirror images. The aroma was an intoxicating mixture of expensive French perfumes, lavender and rose and jasmine, melted beeswax from the hundreds of candles, and the white roses and lilies that overflowed from massive Chinese porcelain vases on every available surface. The orchestra, positioned in a gallery above the main floor, played a Strauss waltz with precision and feeling, the music swelling and falling like waves. Couples whirled across the floor in perfect synchronization, the ladies' gowns creating gorgeous patterns of color, sapphire blue and emerald green, ruby red and amethyst purple, all against the stark black and white of the gentlemen's evening attire. Most of the dancing ladies were young, so young, 16, 17, 18 years old, wrapped in tulle and silk and dreams of the future, their faces flushed with excitement and exertion, their eyes bright with hope. Their partners were often older, established men in their 20s and 30s, men who had achieved enough success to take a wife and needed a fresh young bride to run their households and bear their children. Eleanor positioned herself in her usual place, near a marble column decorated with gilded acanthus leaves and topped with a bust of some Roman goddess. From this vantage point, she could observe without being too conspicuous, could watch the parade of youth and beauty without having to participate. She held a glass of champagne that she did not intend to drink. It merely gave her hands something to do, prevented her from fidgeting nervously. It was then that Lady Pemberton passed by, moving through the crowd like a ship under full sail, her considerable bosom leading the way, her elaborate gown of purple silk rustling with every step. She was accompanied by her daughter Lucinda, an angelic creature of 17 in sky-blue satin that perfectly complemented her golden curls and porcelain complexion. Lucinda was everything Eleanor was not: young, beautiful, sought after. Already 3 men had proposed to her this season, and her mother was holding out for a title, hoping for at least a baronet if not higher. "Oh, Miss Ashford, Lady Pemberton said, stopping briefly beside Eleanor's column. Her tone was the one people used when addressing servants or small children, devoid of real respect or interest. Still attending these events? How persistent of you. Her eyes traveled over Eleanor's gray dress with barely disguised disapproval, taking in every detail. The slightly outdated cut, the absence of jewelry beyond a simple locket, the sensible slippers instead of fashionable dancing shoes. I would have thought you might prefer quieter entertainments at your age. These balls are so exhausting, are they not? All this noise and heat and commotion. I find them tolerable, Lady Pemberton, Eleanor replied with careful politeness, though her fingers tightened on her champagne glass. Lady Pemberton's expression suggested she doubted this. Well, I suppose everyone must make their own choices. Lucinda, darling, come along. Lord Hartley is waiting for us, and we must not keep him. He has expressed particular interest in claiming the supper dance. She leaned slightly closer to Eleanor, her voice dropping to what she clearly intended as a confidential whisper, but which carried perfectly well. It is lamentable when a woman does not accept her destiny, Miss Ashford. Your continued presence at such events only serves to remind everyone of missed opportunities. You should be at home, making yourself useful in some capacity. Perhaps charitable work. Surely there are orphans or poor families who could benefit from your time. With that parting shot, Lady Pemberton swept away, her daughter in tow, leaving Eleanor feeling as if she had been struck. The implication was clear. Eleanor's time would be better spent serving those beneath her station, since she had failed so completely at achieving the station to which she had been born. She was an embarrassment, a failure, someone who should hide herself away rather than continue to haunt the edges of society like an unwanted ghost. Eleanor maintained her composed expression, but something inside her shrank and withered. She was seriously considering leaving, claiming a headache to Caroline and fleeing back to her uncle's house when the atmosphere in the ballroom suddenly changed. The murmur of conversation altered in pitch and intensity, sweeping through the room like a sudden breeze, making heads turn and conversation cease midway through sentences. The Earl of Ashworth had arrived. The name rippled through the crowd in whispers. Ashworth, the Earl? I cannot believe he came. He never attends these things. It has been years. Eleanor found herself turning with everyone else, her curiosity piqued despite herself. She knew of the Earl of Ashworth, of course. Everyone did. He was one of the most eligible men in England, and one of the most unavailable. Sebastian Thorne, the fifth Earl of Ashworth, was a legend whispered in London's ballrooms and drawing rooms, a figure of romance and tragedy that young ladies sighed over and ambitious mothers schemed about uselessly. He was 38 years old, widowed for 5 years, and he rarely appeared at social events. The stories about him were numerous and contradictory. Some said he was devastatingly handsome, others that grief had made him haggard and cold. They said that the death of his wife Catherine during childbirth, taking with her the son he would never know, never hold, never teach to ride or read, had transformed him into a bitter recluse who found no joy in anything. They said he spent his days in his vast estate in Derbyshire, surrounded only by books and memories, that he walked the halls at night like a ghost himself. They said his heart was as cold as the stones of his ancestral castle, that he had sworn never to marry again, that he had rejected every attempt by society to draw him back into the marriage market. But when Eleanor saw him cross the ballroom entrance, what she noticed first was not coldness, but exhaustion, the deep weariness of a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. Sebastian was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders beneath an impeccably cut black evening coat that must have been made by Weston or another of London's finest tailors. His waistcoat was dark gray silk, his cravat tied in a perfect mathematical knot, his movements bearing that particular grace that came from privilege and training. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, worn slightly longer than current fashion dictated, with some silver threads appearing at the temples that only added to his distinguished appearance. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, a face that might have been carved from marble except for the very human pain etched into it. But it was his eyes that captured Eleanor's attention and held it. They were gray, not the pale gray of morning mist, but the deep storm gray of clouds before thunder, eyes that had seen too much and felt too deeply. There was in them a pain so ancient and so familiar that Eleanor felt something tremble and recognize itself in her own chest, as if her loneliness had looked across a crowded room and seen its reflection. Sebastian stood at the entrance for a moment, his eyes scanning the crowd without apparent enthusiasm, a man clearly fulfilling an obligation rather than seeking pleasure. Lady Worthington descended upon him immediately, her face alight with triumph at having secured such a prize for her ball. She greeted him effusively, her voice carrying, "Lord Ashworth, what an unexpected honor. We are so delighted, so very delighted that you could join us this evening." Sebastian responded with mechanical courtesy, bowing over her hand, murmuring the appropriate pleasantries, but Eleanor could see that he was not truly present in the interaction. His body was there, performing the expected rituals, but his mind was elsewhere, perhaps in the past, perhaps simply longing to be anywhere but here. Almost immediately, 3 young debutantes approached, their mothers having pushed them forward with calculated determination and whispered encouragement. Each girl made her curtsy, batting her eyelashes, angling for an introduction, a dance, any scrap of attention from the eligible earl. Eleanor watched as Sebastian politely but firmly refused each one, his voice low, but carrying enough for her to hear, "Thank you, but no. I appreciate the offer, but I must decline. Perhaps another time." His face remained pleasant but closed, the door firmly shut against their attempts at entry. After dispatching the third hopeful young lady, a blonde girl who looked barely 16 and seemed on the verge of tears at his rejection, Sebastian began to move around the perimeter of the ballroom, clearly avoiding the center where he would be trapped by more supplicants. Eleanor watched his progress with detached interest, assuming he would work his way around a room, pay his respects to a few key hostesses, and then escape as quickly as propriety allowed. She was therefore shocked when she realized, with growing alarm, that he was heading directly toward her corner, toward her column, toward the very spot where she had positioned herself to remain unnoticed. Surely, he could not be approaching her. Surely, there must be someone else, something else that had caught his attention. But no, his gray eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart begin to race in a way it had not raced in years. Eleanor felt suddenly, acutely conscious of her great dress, her severe hairstyle, her utter lack of jewels or adornment. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the wallpaper, but there was nowhere to go. "Forgive my intrusion," Sebastian said when he reached her, and his voice was surprisingly soft, with a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in the air between them, intimate despite the crowd surrounding them. "But you seem to me the only person in this entire ballroom who understands that events like this can be simultaneously magnificent and utterly suffocating." Eleanor blinked, certain he must be addressing someone else, that this could not possibly be happening. But no, those gray eyes were fixed directly on hers, waiting for her response. She noticed that up close, his face was lined with fine creases around his eyes and mouth, marks of laughter long abandoned, or perhaps of grief that had carved itself into his very features. "Yes, my lord," she managed to reply, her voice coming out steadier than she had expected. "It is like being inside a jewelry box, dazzling to behold, but not designed for breathing." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. A genuine smile touched his lips, small but unmistakably real, transforming his face from austere to almost warm. "Exactly," he said, and there was relief in his voice, as if he had been searching for someone who understood and had finally found them. "That is precisely it. I have been trying for years to articulate why these events exhaust me so, and you have captured it perfectly in one sentence." He extended his hand in a gesture that was somehow both formal and intimate. "Sebastian Thorne, Earl of Ashworth, though at this moment I would much prefer to be simply Sebastian, a man seeking interesting conversation rather than bearing a title that makes everyone approach me with agendas and schemes." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his, feeling even through their gloves the warmth and solidity of his grip. "Eleanor Ashford," she replied, making a small curtsy, "although I am simply Miss Ashford, with no title at all to burden me." And she added with an honesty that surprised her, that seemed pulled from her by the directness in his gaze, "I am well past the age when people notice me at these events, which grants me a certain freedom to observe rather than participate." Something shifted in Sebastian's expression, a recognition, an understanding, perhaps an identification with her words. "Past the age," he repeated thoughtfully. "And what age might that be, if I may ask?" 34, Eleanor said, lifting her chin slightly, bracing herself for the usual reaction. The slight withdrawal, the cooling of interest, the polite excuse to move away to younger, more promising prospects. But Sebastian did not withdraw. Instead, he moved slightly closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Then we are two of a kind, Miss Ashford. I too have become invisible in these ballrooms, though for different reasons. I am the ghost at the feast, present but not truly participating, observed but not truly seen. People look at me and see either my title or my tragedy, but rarely the man himself." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. In all her years of attending these events, of being overlooked and dismissed, no one had ever spoken to her with such immediate honesty, such vulnerability. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, exactly. They see my age, my unmarried state, and that is all I become. The cautionary tale, the failure, the warning to young girls about being too particular." "And were you?" Sebastian asked, his gray eyes intent on her face. "Too particular?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, grateful that he seemed to genuinely want to know, rather than merely making conversation. "I suppose I was," she admitted. "I wanted more than mere suitability. I wanted understanding, connection, that spark of recognition when you meet someone and feel that you could talk to them for hours and never run out of things to say. I wanted love, Mr. Thorne, Lord Ashworth, and society says that is foolish. That love is a luxury women like me cannot afford." "Please call me Sebastian," he said quietly. "And I do not think wanting love is foolish. I think it is perhaps the only thing that is not foolish in this entire elaborate charade we call society." He paused, his eyes darkening with memory. "I married once without it, you see. For duty, for family expectation, for all the reasons society deems appropriate. And I can tell you from experience that a marriage without love, without genuine connection, is a very lonely thing indeed." They talked. First there, by the column, then slowly walking around the perimeter of the ballroom, Eleanor's hand resting lightly on Sebastian's offered arm, completely oblivious to the shocked stares and scandalized whispers that followed in their wake like a gathering storm. The Earl of Ashworth, who had refused countless young debutantes, who had not shown interest in any woman since his wife's death 5 years prior, was conversing animatedly with Eleanor Ashford, the spinster, the failure, the invisible woman. They talked about books. Sebastian had recently read Dickens' Bleak House and found it both brilliant and devastating in its social commentary. Eleanor confessed she had wept over it, moved by the portrayal of those society had forgotten. They discussed philosophy. Sebastian admitted to being fascinated by the German philosophers, though he found Kant's categorical imperatives somewhat inflexible. Eleanor surprised herself by arguing that moral absolutes might be necessary precisely because humans were so prone to self-justification. They spoke of travel. Sebastian had spent 2 years on the continent after Cambridge, and his eyes lit up as he described standing in the Sistine Chapel, overwhelmed by the beauty Michelangelo had created. Eleanor confessed she had never left England, had never been farther than Kent, but she devoured travel narratives and could describe places she had never seen. "You should see Rome," Sebastian said with sudden passion. "The light there is different from anywhere else, golden and ancient, as if you were walking through history itself. And the art, the architecture, every corner you turn reveals something breathtaking. Perhaps I shall never see it," Eleanor replied with a sadness she tried to hide. "Women in my position rarely travel, rarely do anything of consequence. We exist on the margins, grateful for the small spaces we are allowed to occupy." Sebastian stopped walking, turning to face her fully. They had reached the set of French doors that opened onto the terrace, where the October night gleamed cold and clear beyond the glass. "That," he said firmly, is patently unjust. You have one of the most interesting minds I have encountered in years, Miss Ashford, Eleanor. The way you think, the connections you make between ideas, you should be traveling, studying, debating in universities if they would allow it. Instead, society has decided that because you are 34 and unmarried, you are somehow less valuable, less worthy of opportunity. It is absurd. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of relief at finally being seen as something other than a failure. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "You cannot know how much it means to hear someone say that. To be treated as if my thoughts matter, as if I matter." "You do matter," Sebastian said with such conviction that Eleanor had to look away, overwhelmed. "I have spent the last 5 years believing I was alone in my isolation, in my sense of not fitting into the world society has constructed. But standing here talking with you, I realize I was simply looking in the wrong places for connection." In the days that followed that extraordinary night, the impossible continued. Sebastian called at the Ashford residence the very next day, presenting his card and asking to see Miss Eleanor Ashford, not her uncle, not her aunt, but Eleanor specifically. Uncle Cornelius had been stunned, torn between delight at having an earl show interest in his household and suspicion about what such interest might mean for his troublesome niece. Sebastian sent flowers, not the conventional roses that every other suitor sent, but white lilies and blue hydrangeas arranged with artistry and care, accompanied by a card in his own hand that said, "For the most interesting woman I have met in years. May we continue our conversation?" When Eleanor held that card, running her fingers over the strong, clear handwriting, she felt something she had thought long dead begin to stir in her chest. Hope. He invited her for a carriage ride through Hyde Park, where they continued their discussion of philosophy and literature while the autumn leaves fell around them like colored rain. Then came an invitation to visit the Royal Academy, where they spent 3 hours examining paintings, Sebastian deferring to Eleanor's interpretations with genuine interest rather than the false courtesy men often showed women's opinions. After that, tea at Fortnum and Mason, where they laughed over the ridiculous hats on the ladies at the next table and shared confidences about their childhoods. Is spent in the vast loneliness of Ashworth Hall, hers in the slightly shabby gentility of her father's modest estate before his death. London society watched in growing astonishment and scandal. The Earl was courting the spinster. The whispers grew louder, the speculation more intense. What could he possibly see in her? Was it some strange whim, some rebellion against expectation? Was he perhaps mentally unwell, still deranged by grief? Surely it could not last. Surely he would come to his senses and turn his attention to someone appropriate, young, beautiful, fertile. It was after 3 weeks of this courtship that the other shoe dropped. That reality intruded on Eleanor's growing happiness with brutal force. Eleanor, her Uncle Cornelius, confronted her after Sebastian's latest visit. They were in the library, a dark, oppressive room that smelled of cigar smoke and old leather, filled with books her uncle had purchased by the yard for appearance but never actually read. The late afternoon light struggling through the heavy curtains cast everything in shades of brown and gray. "I do not know what game you are playing with the Earl, but I suggest you cease immediately before you embarrass this family further." Eleanor, who had been reaching for a book, turned slowly to face him. "I am playing no game, Uncle. Lord Ashworth has requested my company, and I have accepted his invitations. There is nothing improper in that. We are always chaperoned, always in public spaces. Improper?" Uncle Cornelius's laugh was harsh and mocking. "You think propriety is the issue here? Eleanor, you are 34 years old. He is an earl, one of the wealthiest and most prominent men in England. He needs a wife who can give him heirs, manage his estates, represent his name in society. He needs someone young, someone of appropriate breeding and beauty. And you," he gestured at her dismissively, "are a woman past her prime, with no fortune, no connections of consequence, and no future. You are deluding yourself catastrophically if you think this is anything more than momentary entertainment for him. Perhaps he is bored. Perhaps he enjoys shocking society. Perhaps it is some twisted form of charity." Each word struck like a lash, But Eleanor forced herself to stand straight, to maintain her dignity. Perhaps, she said, her voice colder than she knew it could be, he simply appreciates my company. Perhaps he values conversation, intelligence, genuine connection over the superficial requirements society dictates. Conversation. Her uncle spat the word as if it were something obscene. Men do not marry for conversation, girl. They marry to produce legitimate heirs, to form political alliances, to increase their wealth and influence. Everything else is window dressing. And you, my dear niece, have nothing to offer in that calculation. You are too old to reliably bear children. The doctors all agree that women past 30 are at severe risk in childbirth. You have no money beyond what I reluctantly provide. You have no family connections that could benefit him. And let us be frank, you are not beautiful enough to compensate for these deficiencies. Eleanor felt each word land, felt them confirm her deepest fears, the insecurities she tried so hard to silence. He has continued to seek my company, she insisted, but her voice had lost its certainty. He has been attentive, considerate. For now. Uncle Cornelius moved closer, looming over her with barely contained anger. Do you know what will happen when this infatuation ends, as it inevitably will? You will be a laughingstock. Every matron in London is already whispering about the old maid who deluded herself into thinking she had caught an earl. When he moves on, when he realizes the foolishness of this dalliance and turns his attention to someone appropriate, you will be left with nothing. Not even the small dignity you currently possess. You will be the cautionary tale they tell to frighten young girls. Do not be too particular, or you will end up like Eleanor Ashford, clinging desperately to false hope in her twilight years. It is not false, Eleanor whispered, but even she could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. He has been sincere, I am certain of it. Are you? Her uncle's voice softened into something almost pitying, which was somehow worse than his anger. Eleanor, I say this not to be cruel, but to be realistic. You are not in his world. You do not belong there. And the sooner you accept that, the less painful the inevitable end will be. You should be grateful for the attention while it lasts, but do not mistake temporary amusement for genuine regard. Do not mistake politeness for love. Eleanor fled the library, her uncle's words echoing in her mind, poisoning the happiness she had been nurturing so carefully. She retreated to her small bedroom, that cramped space that contained all her worldly possessions, a few books, some worn dresses, the dried flowers Sebastian had sent. She sat on her narrow bed and forced herself to face the questions that had been lurking at the edges of her consciousness. What if Uncle Cornelius was right? What if this was merely a momentary aberration in Sebastian's behavior, a brief rebellion against society's expectations that would end when he came to his senses? What if she was being foolish, setting herself up for a devastating fall? But Sebastian continued to call, continued to seek her presence. And 3 weeks after their first conversation at the Worthington Ball, during an outing to Kensington Gardens, he asked Eleanor to marry him. They were walking through a less frequented path, surrounded by perfectly trimmed boxwood hedges and beds of chrysanthemums that still resisted stubbornly against the cold. The October afternoon was glorious, the sky a brilliant blue streaked with wisps of white cloud. The air had that sharp, clean quality that comes just before winter, carrying the scent of earth and fallen leaves and the distant smoke of coal fires being lit in preparation for evening. Eleanor had brought a shawl of soft wool over her dress of green muslin, a dress that Caroline had insisted she borrow, saying the color brought out the gold in her hazel eyes. The gardens were relatively quiet on this weekday afternoon. A few nursemaids pushed perambulators along distant paths. An elderly gentleman sat on a bench feeding crumbs to pigeons, but otherwise they had this corner of the park to themselves. The leaves were at the peak of their autumn glory, crimson and gold and amber, creating a canopy of fire above their heads. Some had already fallen, carpeting the gravel path with a rustling tapestry of color that crunched softly beneath their feet. They had been discussing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Eleanor had just reread it and was fascinated by its exploration of creation and responsibility. Sebastian was arguing that Victor Frankenstein's greatest sin was not creating the monster, but abandoning it, refusing to take responsibility for what he had brought into the world. Eleanor was countering that the monster's subsequent murders could not be entirely blamed on his creator, that at some point individual responsibility must matter. But what is responsibility without the capacity to choose? Sebastian was saying, his voice animated, his hand gesturing as he made his point. The creature was brought into the world without his consent, with no guidance, no education about how to navigate society. Is it any wonder he stopped abruptly, his hands stilling in mid-gesture. They had reached a small clearing where a fountain stood, its water turned off for the season, surrounded by a circle of stone benches. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, creating patterns of gold and shadow on the ground. Sebastian turned to face Eleanor fully, taking both her hands in his. His gray eyes were intense, filled with an emotion that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. "Eleanor," he said, and there was a tremor in his voice that she had never heard before. "Forgive me, but I cannot continue this conversation. I cannot continue pretending that I asked you to walk with me today, merely to discuss literature. I have been trying to find the right moment, the right words, but I am discovering that there are no right words for what I need to say. There is only truth." Eleanor's heart began to pound so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "Sebastian," she whispered, almost afraid of what might come next. He took a deep breath, his hands tightening on hers. "I have spent the last 5 years existing rather than living. After Catherine died, after I lost my son, I convinced myself that I was done with feeling, done with hoping, done with the possibility of happiness. I performed my duties, managed my estates, fulfilled my obligations to my tenants and my title, but inside I was hollow. A shell going through the motions of life without actually participating in it." He paused, and Eleanor saw the pain in his eyes, old pain that had carved deep channels in his soul. "Then I met you," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "That night at the Worthingtons' ball, when I saw you standing there in your gray dress, looking as lonely and displaced as I felt, something in me recognized something in you. And when we spoke, when we truly conversed about ideas and feelings and the absurdities of the world we inhabit, Eleanor, it was like waking up after years of sleep, like remembering what it felt like to be fully alive." Tears began to slide down Eleanor's cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. She was frozen, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that any movement might shatter this moment. "These past 3 weeks have been the happiest of my adult life," Sebastian said, and now there were tears in his eyes too. "Every conversation with you reveals new depths, new facets of who you are. You challenge me, make me laugh, see me as a man rather than a title or a tragedy. With you, I am simply Sebastian, no more, no less. And I have fallen so deeply in love with you that I cannot imagine a future in which you are not beside me." He released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. When he opened it, Eleanor gasped. Inside was a ring, an emerald surrounded by small diamonds, the green stone glowing with inner fire even in the dappled shade of the trees. "This was my grandmother's ring," Sebastian explained softly. "Not Catherine's. I want you to understand that. Catherine wore the Ashworth rubies, as is tradition for the Countess. But this ring belonged to my grandmother Lillian, who married my grandfather when she was 33 years old after refusing a dozen suitors in her youth. She waited for love, Eleanor, just as you did. And she and my grandfather had 42 years of marriage that everyone who knew them described as extraordinarily happy. She lived to be 75, and when she died, my grandfather wept as if he had lost her that very day, though they had been married 4 decades. He knelt then, there on the leaf-strewn path, heedless of the damp ground or the possibility of being observed. "Eleanor Ashford," he said, his voice steady now, filled with certainty, "would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Of allowing me to spend whatever years remain to us proving that you are always worthy of being loved? That it was never too late for you, you were simply waiting for the right moment, the right person?" Eleanor could barely see him through her tears. Every fear, every doubt, every cruel word that had been spoken about her age and her unmarried state rose up in her mind. She thought of Uncle Cornelius's warnings, of Lady Victoria's future objections that would surely come, of society's judgment. But louder than all of those voices was the truth she could see in Sebastian's eyes, could hear in his voice. He meant every word. This was not pity or amusement or rebellion. This was love, real and deep and transformative. Yes, she whispered, and then louder, with more conviction. Yes, Sebastian, yes. I will marry you. The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise, like spring after endless winter. He stood quickly, removing the ring from its box and sliding it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the emerald catching the light and sending green sparks dancing. And then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her as if she were infinitely precious, as if he had found something he had thought lost forever. Thank you, he murmured into her hair. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for existing. Thank you for waiting. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the glory of autumn, while the world continued around them. Nursemaids with their charges, the old man with his pigeons, the leaves falling like slow rain. Eleanor felt something fundamental shift inside her, like a door long locked finally swinging open. She had been so certain that happiness was not meant for her, that she had missed her chance, that she would spend her life in the margins. But here, in Sebastian's arms, she understood that her life had not been a series of mistakes leading to loneliness. It had been a journey leading to this moment, to this man, to this love. When they finally separated, both wiping their eyes and laughing a bit self-consciously, Sebastian said, "We should return to your uncle's house and inform him officially. Though I suspect he will have opinions about this development. He will likely try to talk you out of it," Eleanor warned, though she said it lightly, still floating on the euphoria of the moment. "Then he will fail," Sebastian replied firmly. "Eleanor, you need to understand something. My family will likely oppose this match. My sister Victoria especially. She has very fixed ideas about what is appropriate, about what age a countess should be, about producing heirs and maintaining family dignity. But their opinions do not matter to me. What matters is you and I, and the life we will build together." Eleanor nodded, trying to prepare herself mentally for the battles ahead. But nothing could have prepared her for the viciousness of what was to come. The response was immediate and brutal. 2 days after Eleanor accepted Sebastian's proposal, 2 days during which she walked around in a haze of happiness, staring at the emerald on her finger and hardly believing her fortune, she received a summons to the Thorne family property in Mayfair. The note was formal, cold, requesting her presence that afternoon to discuss matters of mutual concern. It was not signed by Sebastian. Eleanor dressed with care, choosing her best dress, a deep blue that Caroline had given her, saying it no longer fit. She arranged her hair carefully, trying to look dignified and appropriate for the family she was about to join. But her hands trembled as she pinned the last curl in place, and her reflection in the mirror showed eyes wide with apprehension. The Thorne townhouse in Mayfair was magnificent, a 4-story Georgian building in pristine white stone, with a black iron fence and window boxes that even in October held late-blooming flowers. A liveried footman answered her knock and led her through a marble-floored entrance hall decorated with classical statuary and enormous Chinese vases, up a curved staircase with an ornate brass balustrade, and into a drawing room on the first floor. The room was decorated in shades of Prussian blue and silver, with silk wallpaper and Louis XIV furniture that looked beautiful and supremely uncomfortable. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Thornes staring down with aristocratic hauteur. And seated in the center of this splendor, like judges at a tribunal, were Sebastian's sister Lady Victoria Pembroke and his younger brother Lord Edmund Thorne. Lady Victoria was a handsome woman of 50, with Sebastian's dark hair now heavily streaked with gray, and the same gray eyes but without any of his warmth or depth. She was dressed in burgundy silk with extensive jewelry, emeralds at her throat and ears, rings on every finger. Everything about her proclaimed wealth, status, and absolute certainty in her own judgment. Beside her sat Edmund, 35 years old, with his brother's features but coarser, less refined. Where Sebastian's face showed sensitivity and intelligence, Edmund showed indulgence and a certain cruelty around the mouth. Miss Ashford, Lady Victoria said without preamble, not rising, not offering tea or any gesture of hospitality. Her voice was cold, clipped, the accent of someone who had never had to concern herself with being liked. Please sit. We shall not waste time with pleasantries. Eleanor sat on the indicated chair, a delicate gilt thing that forced her to perch uncomfortably on its edge. She folded her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking, and met Lady Victoria's gaze steadily, refusing to show the fear that was crawling up her spine. Let us be direct, Lady Victoria continued, her eyes hard as flint. This farce of an engagement must end immediately. It is unsuitable in every conceivable way, and we cannot permit it to continue. Eleanor felt her blood run cold, but she forced herself to speak calmly. I do not know what you mean, Lady Victoria. Your brother asked me to marry him, and I accepted. There is no farce about it. My brother, Edmund interjected, his voice carrying a sneer that twisted his features, is still in mourning for his wife and child. Oh, I know it has been 5 years, but grief does strange things to a man's judgment. He is not in his right mind, clearly, or he would never have made such an absurd proposal. 5 years is a considerable period of mourning, Eleanor said quietly, and your brother seems perfectly lucid to me. He is a grown man, capable of making his own decisions. Capable. Lady Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Miss Ashford, let us dispense with politeness and speak plainly. You are not suitable to be Countess of Ashworth. You are 34 years old. 34. Do you understand what that means for a woman of your station? It means you are past your prime, past the age when ladies are expected to marry. Young ladies marry between 15 and 21, perhaps 23 at the absolute latest. By 34, a woman who has not married is considered a failure, and there are reasons for that failure. Each word struck Eleanor like a physical blow, but she held Lady Victoria's gaze, refusing to flinch, refusing to give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Sebastian is an earl, Lady Victoria continued, her voice rising with each word, gaining passion and venom. He is one of the premier peers of England, with estates in 5 counties, with a seat in the House of Lords, with responsibilities to his tenants, his title, his family name. He needs an heir, a legitimate male heir to inherit everything our family has built over centuries. And you, Miss Ashford, are far beyond the safe age for childbearing. Women have children at 34, Eleanor managed to say, though her voice was barely above a whisper. It is not unheard of. Women die at 34 trying to have children. Lady Victoria nearly shouted, standing abruptly from her chair and taking several steps toward Eleanor, looming over her like a bird of prey. Do you have any idea of the risks? I have lost 3 acquaintances to childbirth, and 2 of them were over 30. The doctors are unanimous on this point. The older the woman, the greater the danger to both mother and child. Would you kill my brother a second time, Miss Ashford? Would you force him to bury another wife, to lose another child, to live through that nightmare again? The accusation hit Eleanor like a slap. She had not thought of it in those terms, and not considered that attempting to give Sebastian a child might put him through the same agony he had already endured. Doubt crept into her heart like poison. And even if you survived, Edmund added, standing as well and approaching from the other side, so that Eleanor was surrounded, trapped between them like prey, what guarantee do we have that you could even conceive? A woman of your age, unmarried for so long, there must be something wrong with you, some deficiency. If you were capable of bearing children, you would have married years ago. Some man would have claimed you. The fact that no one has suggested that you are barren, damaged in some essential way. That is cruel, Eleanor said, her voice shaking now with anger and hurt. That is unfounded and cruel. You know nothing about me, about why I did not marry earlier. We know everything we need to know, Lady Victoria hissed, her face close to Eleanor's now, close enough that Eleanor could smell her expensive perfume and see the fine lines around her eyes. We know you are a spinster of 34 with no fortune, no connections of consequence, no beauty to recommend you. We know you saw an opportunity when my brother, in a moment of weakness, of loneliness, paid you attention, and you seized it with both hands like the desperate woman you are. That is not true, Eleanor protested, standing up now, refusing to remain seated while they attacked her from above. I love him. I did not seek this, did not expect it. Love. Edmund laughed mockingly. Do you think Sebastian loves you? Truly. A man who could have any young beauty in England, any fresh debutante of good family and proper age? He could marry Lady Arabella Hartley, who is 19 years old, beautiful as a summer's day, daughter of a duke, with a dowry of £20,000. Or Miss Charlotte Pemberton at 17, with her delicate features and impeccable breeding. These are appropriate wives for an earl, Miss Ashford. Young women who can give him healthy children, who can manage his households, who can represent the Ashworth name with dignity and grace. Your brother chose me, Eleanor said, and despite everything, there was strength in her voice now, a core of certainty that these cruel people could not quite extinguish. He did not choose those young ladies. He chose me, knowing my age, knowing everything about me. That must mean something. It means he is confused, Lady Victoria said, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, which was somehow more terrifying than her anger. It means he is lonely, and you happen to be there, offering companionship and conversation. But, Miss Ashford, surely you must see that this cannot last. The novelty will wear off. He will wake up one morning and look at you, really look at you, and see what everyone else sees, a woman past her prime, unsuitable in every way. And then what? You will be cast aside, humiliated, with nowhere to go and no prospects. You will be a laughingstock, the pathetic spinster who briefly deluded herself into thinking she had captured an earl. The words hurt because they echoed Eleanor's own deepest fears, the doubts that whispered in the darkest hours of the night. What if they were right? What if Sebastian's interest was temporary, based on some romantic notion that would not survive the harsh light of day-to-day reality? Edmund moved to a small table by the window and returned with a leather portfolio. We are not unreasonable people, Miss Ashford, he said, his voice taking on a smooth, almost kind quality that was worse than his earlier contempt. We understand your situation. We know your uncle provides for you grudgingly, that you have no real security or prospects. That is why we are prepared to make you an offer. He opened the portfolio, revealing papers covered in neat legal script. If you voluntarily end this engagement, if you go to Sebastian and tell him that you have reconsidered, that you believe he deserves someone younger and more suitable, we are prepared to settle £5,000 on you. Enough to purchase a small cottage in the country, to live independently without having to rely on your uncle's charity or seek employment. You would be comfortable, Miss Ashford. Secure. You could have a quiet, dignified life. It was bribery. Naked, shameless bribery. They were trying to buy her off, to pay her to disappear from Sebastian's life. Eleanor stared at the papers, at the figure written there. £5,000, a fortune for someone in her position, enough to transform her life from dependence to independence. For a moment, just a moment, she was tempted. Not because she doubted her love for Sebastian, but because their words had planted seeds of doubt about his love for her. What if he did come to regret choosing her? What if she was condemning him to a life of disappointment, perhaps even to repeating the tragedy of losing a wife in childbirth? Wouldn't it be more loving to set him free, to let him find someone who could give him everything he needed without risk? But then she remembered the look in his eyes when he proposed, the certainty in his voice when he said he loved her, the way he spoke of his grandmother, who had also married late and lived a long, happy life. She remembered 3 weeks of conversation, of genuine connection, of being seen and valued for who she actually was. And she knew with sudden clarity that to accept this money would be to betray not just Sebastian, but herself, to accept society's judgment that she was worth less because of her age, that she did not deserve happiness, that she should accept crumbs rather than feast at the table of love. Eleanor straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and looked Lady Victoria directly in the eye. I did not come here to be insulted or bought, she said, her voice low, but vibrating with emotion that she no longer tried to hide. I came because I received a summons, thinking perhaps you wished to welcome me into the family, however reluctantly. Instead, I find myself accused of being desperate, barren, unsuitable, of being fundamentally unworthy simply because I am 34 years old rather than 17. She took a breath, feeling power flow into her voice. But I will not be dismissed so easily. I love Sebastian, and unless I am very much mistaken, he loves me. Not because he is confused or lonely or rebelling against you, but because we have found in each other what every human being seeks: understanding, companionship, genuine connection. You call me unsuitable because of my age? I call your values warped if you believe a woman's worth expires at 21. How dare you? Lady Victoria breathed, her face flushing with anger. You insolent! I am not finished, Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with her own courage. You warned me that I might not survive childbirth, that I might kill your brother with grief if I try to give him an heir. Do you not think Sebastian and I have considered this? Do you not think we are capable of making our own decisions about our lives? And as for being barren or damaged, that is pure speculation on your part, designed to wound me and undermine my confidence. You do not know what the future holds for any of us. She moved toward the door, her hand shaking, but her voice steady. I will not voluntarily end this engagement. If Sebastian wishes to end it, he may tell me himself. But I will not accept your money, your judgment, or your attempts to control both your brother's life and mine. Thank you for making your position clear. I will show myself out. She walked from the room with as much dignity as she could muster, down the curved staircase, through the marble hall, and out into the street, where the afternoon sun seemed blindingly bright after the dim oppression of that drawing room. Only when she was safely in the hired cab, the Thorn townhouse receding behind her, did she allow herself to shake, to press her hands to her face, to release the tears she had been holding back. But they were not tears of defeat. They were tears of rage and fear, and surprisingly, a kind of fierce pride. She had stood up to them. She had refused their money and their attempts to intimidate her. She had claimed her right to love and be loved, regardless of what society decreed was appropriate. The question was, what would Sebastian say when his family told him about this meeting? Would he stand by her, or would their words plant seeds of doubt in his mind as well? Eleanor spent a sleepless night tossing in her bed, alternating between fierce determination and crippling doubt. She did not tell Sebastian about the meeting. She wanted to see if he would come to her to hear if his feelings had changed. For 2 days, she heard nothing, and with each passing hour, her fears grew. Perhaps they had gotten to him. Perhaps he was reconsidering. Perhaps. And then, on the 3rd day, Sebastian arrived at her uncle's house in a fury. Eleanor was in the morning room, attempting to focus on needlework and failing miserably, when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall, raised voices, her uncle's protests, and then heavy footsteps approaching rapidly. The door burst open without warning, and Sebastian stood there, his face flushed with anger, his usually immaculate hair disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. Eleanor, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Why did you not tell me? Uncle Cornelius appeared in the doorway behind him, looking affronted and anxious in equal measure. My lord, this is most irregular. Leave us, Sebastian commanded, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. No, I will do no such thing. This is my house, and Miss Ashford is under my protection. Then protect her from my family's cruelty. Sebastian rounded on him, his aristocratic bearing suddenly very apparent, the centuries of command inherent in his title making itself felt. Or have you already had your say as well? Have you also told her she is too old, too unsuitable, too unworthy? Uncle Cornelius paled and stepped back. My lord, I merely expressed concerns about the appropriateness. Get out. Sebastian's voice was quiet now, but it carried absolute authority. Uncle Cornelius left, pulling the door closed behind him, though Eleanor suspected he would linger in the hallway attempting to eavesdrop. Sebastian crossed the room in 3 strides and took Eleanor's hands, pulling her to her feet. Victoria told me about your meeting. Not immediately. She waited 2 days, thinking I would forget you, move on, that the engagement would simply dissolve through inaction. When I confronted her about why I had received no response to my messages, yes, Eleanor, I have sent 3 messages in as many days, which her uncle apparently never delivered, she finally admitted that she and Edmund had interviewed you. Oh, Eleanor breathed. So that was why she had heard nothing. Her uncle had been intercepting Sebastian's communications, likely hoping the silence would drive them apart. She told me what they said to you, Sebastian continued, his voice tight with fury. Every cruel accusation, every insult. She thought I would approve, Eleanor. She thought I would thank her for protecting me from making a terrible mistake. He laughed bitterly. She was genuinely shocked when I told her she was no longer welcome in any of my homes, that she had overstepped so egregiously that I wanted nothing to do with her. Sebastian, no, Eleanor protested. She is your sister. You cannot cut her off because of me. Because of you? He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. Eleanor, she attacked you. She tried to bribe you to leave me. She called you barren and desperate and unsuitable. She reduced you to your age as if that single number defines your entire worth as a human being. And you think I should forgive that? You think I should allow anyone, family or otherwise, to treat you that way? Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. But what if she is right? The words burst out before she could stop them, all the fears of the past 3 days pouring forth. Sebastian, I am 34. The risks of childbirth are real. What if I cannot give you an heir? What if I die trying, and you have to go through that horror again? What if? He silenced her with a kiss, fierce and desperate, and full of everything he could not put into words. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard, both with tears on their faces. Listen to me, Sebastian said, his hands still framing her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. Listen well, Eleanor Ashford, because I will only say this once, and then I never want to hear you doubt it again. I have had a young wife. Catherine was 18 when we married, the perfect age according to society, young and healthy and fertile. And do you know what we had together? Nothing. Pleasant superficiality. Polite conversations about nothing of consequence. She was afraid of me, I think, or perhaps simply had no interest in knowing me beyond my title and what I could provide. We lived as polite strangers, sharing a house but never truly connecting. He paused, his gray eyes intense on hers. When she died in childbirth, I grieved. But Eleanor, if I am honest, and I am trying to be completely honest with you now, I grieve more for the child I lost, for the son I never got to hold, than for Catherine herself. How terrible is that? I mourned the woman I was married to, but I mourned more the loss of possibility, the loss of what might have been if we had ever truly known each other. And that grief, that guilt over not having loved her as she deserved, nearly destroyed me. Sebastian took a shaky breath. For 5 years, I have been dead inside, going through the motions of life without truly living. And then I met you. You, with your sharp mind and your hidden depths, and your refusal to accept platitudes or easy answers. You who challenge me and make me think and make me feel things I thought I would never feel again. With you, Eleanor, I am finally alive. I am finally myself, not the title or the tragic figure or the duty-bound peer. Just Sebastian, man who has found the woman he wants to spend his life with. But I cannot guarantee you an heir, Eleanor whispered. I cannot guarantee I would survive trying. Then we will not try, Sebastian said simply. Eleanor, I already lost a child. That pain is carved into my bones. If I had to choose between having you in my life without children, or having a dozen heirs without you, I choose you. I choose you every time, in every circumstance. My cousin Henry can inherit if I die without an heir. The title will survive. What matters is that I finally have a chance at happiness, at love, at a marriage that is real rather than a facade. Your family will hate me, she said, but she could hear that her resistance was weakening, that she was beginning to believe, beginning to hope again. My family, Sebastian said with steel in his voice, will learn to accept my decision or they will have no place in my life. I am done letting them dictate my choices, my happiness. I am done living for duty and tradition and what is appropriate." His voice softened. "Eleanor, you asked me once if I had considered that I might deserve a second chance at life. Well, you are my second chance. You are my opportunity to do it right this time, to build a marriage based on love and respect and genuine partnership, rather than social expectation." He released her face and took her hand, the one wearing his grandmother's ring. This emerald belonged to a woman who also married late by society's standards. "My grandmother Lillian was 33, nearly your age, when she married my grandfather. Everyone said she was too old, that she had waited too long, that she would likely die in childbirth. Do you know what happened? She had 3 healthy children, my father, my Aunt Charlotte, and my Uncle William, all born after she was 33. And she lived to be 75 years old, vigorous and sharp-minded until the very end. My grandfather was devoted to her until his own death 3 years after hers. Their marriage was legendary in our family for its happiness." Eleanor stared at the ring through her tears, seeing it with new eyes. "You never told me that story." "I wanted to," Sebastian admitted. "But I wanted you to accept my proposal for yourself, not because of some reassuring family precedent. But now, after what Victoria said to you, I think you need to hear it. Eleanor, late marriages are not doomed. Women over 30 can and do have healthy children. Society's rules about appropriate ages are arbitrary and cruel, designed to control women and reduce them to their reproductive capacity." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "I'm not asking you to guarantee me anything. Not children, not conformity to social expectations, not perfection. I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner, my love. To build a life with me based on who we actually are rather than who society says we should be. That is all I want. That is all I have ever wanted since the moment we started talking at that ball." Eleanor buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of him, sandalwood and leather and something uniquely Sebastian. She let herself feel his solid warmth, the steady beat of his heart under her ear. And slowly, the fears that his family had planted began to dissolve, replaced by certainty. This was real. This was right. And society's judgment, cruel as it might be, could not change that fundamental truth. "Yes," she whispered against his chest. "Yes, I still want to marry you. I am sorry I doubted, sorry I let them get into my head." "Never apologize for being human," Sebastian interrupted, tipping her face up to his. "Never apologize for having fears. God knows I have enough of my own. The question is not whether we doubt or fear, but whether we choose courage anyway. Whether we choose love even when it is difficult." "Then I choose courage," Eleanor said, and felt the truth of it resonate through her. "I choose love. I choose you, Sebastian, whatever comes." He kissed her again, softer this time, sweet and full of promise. When they parted, both were smiling through their tears. "We will marry soon," Sebastian said. "I will not give my family time to mount further campaigns against us. 3 weeks from now, in the chapel at Ashworth Hall. A small ceremony with only those who truly support us in attendance. Will that suit you?" "Perfectly," Eleanor agreed. "Though I warn you, Caroline will want to help me choose a dress, and she has very strong opinions." Sebastian laughed, the sound of pure joy that transformed his face. "Let her. After all we have been through, Caroline deserves some happiness too. She has been your ally through all this. She has," Eleanor confirmed. "She was furious when Uncle Cornelius tried to prevent your messages from reaching me. I think she may have threatened him with public scandal if he interfered again." "I like her already," Sebastian declared. "She will be most welcome at the wedding." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and gathering storms. Lady Victoria refused to attend the wedding, as did Edmund and several other family members who saw the match as beneath the dignity of the Ashworth name. But surprisingly, there were allies too. The Duchess of Somerset, who had sent Eleanor that encouraging letter earlier, announced publicly that she would attend and that anyone who had a problem with the match could take it up with her directly. Coming from a duchess known for her sharp tongue and even sharper social influence, this was powerful support. Caroline threw herself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm, insisting that Eleanor deserved a beautiful dress regardless of her age. They chose silk in a deep cream color, not the virginal white of young brides, but something rich and sophisticated that suited Eleanor perfectly. The dress was made with a fitted bodice and flowing skirts, elegant lace at the collar and cuffs, and pearl buttons down the back. When Eleanor tried it on for the final fitting, she barely recognized herself. She looked, she thought with wonder, like a woman who was loved, happy and confident and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth. On the morning of the wedding, Eleanor woke early in the guest room of Ashworth Hall, where she had arrived the day before. The estate was magnificent, a great house of gray stone set in rolling parkland, with formal gardens and a deer park and a small stream that wound through the grounds. Her room overlooked the gardens, and she stood at the window watching the November sunrise paint everything in shades of gold and rose, her heart full of emotions she could hardly name. This was her wedding day. After 34 years of being told she was too old, too particular, too unmarriageable, she was getting married. And not out of desperation or compromise, but for love. Real, genuine, transformative love. Caroline arrived to help her dress, her face glowing with excitement. "Oh, Eleanor," she breathed as she helped fasten the pearl buttons. "You look absolutely radiant. I knew this color would be perfect for you." When Eleanor was finally ready, she looked at herself in the full-length mirror and felt tears prick her eyes. The woman looking back at her was not young. There were fine lines around her eyes, and her figure was that of a mature woman rather than a girl. But she was beautiful in a way that transcended youth. She looked like someone who had lived, who had suffered and survived, who had waited for the right love rather than settling for convenience. Her hazel eyes shone with happiness, her skin glowed with health and contentment, and her smile was radiant. "You are a bride," Caroline said softly, squeezing her hand. Finally, you are getting everything you deserve." The chapel at Ashworth Hall was small and intimate, built of the same gray stone as the main house, with beautiful stained glass windows that cast pools of colored light on the stone floor. It could hold perhaps 50 people, and even that would be crowded. Today there were perhaps 20 in attendance, the Duchess of Somerset in a place of honor, Caroline and few loyal friends, some of Sebastian's tenants who had insisted on attending, and Sebastian's elderly uncle George, who had ignored his daughter Victoria's protests and come to support his nephew. But Eleanor barely noticed who was there and who was not. From the moment she entered the chapel and saw Sebastian standing at the altar, everything else faded away. He wore formal black, stark and elegant, and his face when he turned to watch her approach was a study in wonder and love. His gray eyes shone with unshed tears, and his smile was so full of joy that it took her breath away. Eleanor walked down the aisle alone. Uncle Cornelius had refused to give her away, saying he would not participate in such a foolish match. But Eleanor did not need him. She walked on her own feet, making her own choice, claiming her own happiness. And when she reached Sebastian and took his offered hand, she felt more powerful and complete than she had ever felt in her life. The ceremony was traditional, but deeply felt. The Reverend, an elderly man who had known Sebastian since childhood, spoke about the true meaning of marriage, not as a social contract or a breeding arrangement, but as a union of souls, a commitment to love and cherish through whatever life might bring. When the time came for vows, Sebastian spoke as clearly and firmly, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "I, Sebastian William Thorne, take thee, Eleanor Rose Ashford, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she repeated her vows, but it was not from doubt. It was from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. "I, Eleanor Rose Ashford, take thee, Sebastian William Thorne, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, and Sebastian kissed her, Eleanor felt as if her heart would burst with happiness. The small congregation applauded, and the Duchess of Somerset called out, "Well done, my dears. Show them all how it is done." The wedding breakfast was held in the great dining room of Ashworth Hall, a magnificent space with oak paneling and portraits of generations of thorns looking down from the walls. The meal was excellent, the champagne flowed freely, and the conversation was warm and genuine. These were not the ambitious, judgmental people who populated London's ballrooms. These were genuine well-wishers who were happy to see Sebastian finding love again. Uncle George, who looked remarkably like an older version of Sebastian, stood to make a toast. "I remember Sebastian as a boy," he said, his voice carrying despite his age. "Serious, sensitive, always thinking too deeply about everything. And I remember how he changed after Catherine died, how the light went out of him, how he became a ghost in his own life." He paused, looking at Sebastian and Eleanor with warmth. "But today, I see my nephew alive again. I see him happy, genuinely happy, in a way I have not seen since he was a child. And that, my friends, is what marriage should do. It should bring light and life, not duty and obligation. Eleanor, welcome to our family. You have given us back our Sebastian, and for that, we are eternally grateful." Eleanor had to wipe tears from her eyes as the guests applauded. She looked at Sebastian and saw that he too was moved, his hand gripping hers tightly under the table. After the breakfast, there was dancing in the ballroom, nothing like the grand balls of London, but intimate and joyful. Sebastian led Eleanor in the first waltz, holding her close as they moved across the floor. "How does it feel, Lady Ashworth?" he murmured in her ear. "To finally be a countess." Eleanor laughed, feeling lighter than air. "Truthfully, the title means nothing compared to being your wife. I would have married you if you were a penniless clerk, Sebastian. You must know that." "I do know that," he replied, pulling her closer. "That is one of the many reasons I love you. You see me, not my title or my estates. Just Sebastian." "Just Sebastian," Eleanor agreed, "is quite enough for me." They spent their wedding night in the master suite of Ashworth Hall, a room that Eleanor had been nervous about entering. This had been Sebastian's room with Catherine, and she had worried about feeling like an interloper, a poor substitute. But Sebastian had anticipated this. When he led her into the room, she saw immediately that it had been completely redecorated. The heavy dark furniture Catherine had preferred was gone, replaced with lighter pieces in warm wood tones. The walls had been repainted in a soft blue-gray, and the bed was new, dressed in linens of cream and gold. "I wanted this to be ours," Sebastian explained, watching her take in the changes. "Not mine and Catherine's, with you as an afterthought. Ours, Eleanor. Our room, our life, our fresh start." The thoughtfulness of it undid her completely. Eleanor turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "How did I get so lucky?" she whispered. "How did I find you?" "I think," Sebastian said, drawing her into his arms, "we found each other. Two lonely souls who refused to give up on the possibility of real connection, real love." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "And now we have the rest of our lives to build something beautiful together." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that was made sweeter by the long wait, by the depth of emotion between them. Eleanor had feared that her inexperience would be awkward, that at 34 she would somehow be inadequate. But Sebastian was patient and gentle, guiding her with love and care, and she found that intimacy between two people who truly loved each other was nothing like the clinical description she had read or the fearful whispers she had heard. It was connection in its purest form, not just physical, but emotional and spiritual as well. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, Eleanor's head on Sebastian's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I want you to know," he said softly, his fingers trailing through her hair, "that I meant what I said about children. If you never want to try, if you are afraid of the risks, I will never pressure you. What we have right now, just the two of us, it is enough. It is more than enough." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then she said, I am afraid of the risks. I would be lying if I said otherwise. But Sebastian, I find that I am more afraid of living my life based on fear, based on what might go wrong rather than what might go right. Your grandmother had 3 healthy children after 33. Other women have succeeded where others failed. And I think I would like to try. Not immediately, but someday. If it happens, wonderful. If it does not, we will still have each other. Sebastian's arms tightened around her. If you are certain, I am, Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. I am certain that I want to live fully, not cautiously. I am certain that I want to build a complete life with you, whatever that might look like. Then we shall try, Sebastian agreed. But on our own timeline, in our own way. Not because society demands heirs, but because we want to create a family together. The months that followed were the happiest of Eleanor's life. She and Sebastian settled into Ashworth Hall, and Eleanor threw herself into learning to manage the great estate. She met with the housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, and won her over with genuine interest in the workings of the household. She visited the tenants, bringing medicine and food to those in need, listening to their concerns and working with Sebastian to address problems with housing and agricultural practices. She organized a school for the tenant children, arguing passionately with Sebastian about the importance of education for all classes until he laughingly agreed and provided the funding. London society watched their marriage with varying degrees of skepticism, waiting for it to fall apart, for Sebastian to realize his mistake. But as months passed and the Earl and Countess of Ashworth appeared genuinely happy, attending select social events together, always clearly devoted to each other, the whispers began to change. Some of the sharper-tongued matrons still sneered, but others began to whisper different questions. What if they had been wrong about appropriate ages for marriage? What if Eleanor Ashford, Eleanor Thorne now, was actually a perfect match for the Earl? What if love mattered more than youth? Lady Victoria remained estranged, but Uncle George became a frequent visitor, delighting in his nephew's happiness. Caroline married Lord Pemberton in the spring, and Eleanor stood as her matron of honor, the 2 cousins closer than ever. The Duchess of Somerset became a dear friend, often writing to Eleanor with sardonic observations about society and encouragement to continue defying expectations. The question of children remained uncertain for a while. Then, 18 months after their wedding, Eleanor realized she had missed her courses. She waited another month to be sure before telling Sebastian, afraid to get his hopes up only to be disappointed. When she finally did tell him, on a soft June evening as they walked through Ashworth's rose garden, Sebastian actually fell to his knees, pressing his face against her still flat stomach, overcome with emotion. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice muffled against her dress. "As certain as I can be," Eleanor replied, running her fingers through his hair. "Sebastian, I am terrified. What if something goes wrong? What if—" He stood quickly, pulling her into his arms. "Then we will face it together. But Eleanor, let us not borrow trouble from the future. Let us simply be grateful for this moment, for this possibility. Whatever comes, we face it together." The pregnancy was carefully monitored. Sebastian hired the best physicians in London, insisting on regular examinations despite Eleanor's embarrassment at so much attention. She was, after all, 36 years old, well beyond what was considered safe by conventional wisdom. But she was also healthy, strong from years of walking and active living, and the physicians, while cautious, were cautiously optimistic. As her body changed, as her belly swelled with new life, Eleanor experienced a complex mixture of fear and wonder. There were days when she was certain something would go wrong, that she would be punished for daring to be happy, for daring to attempt motherhood at such an advanced age. But there were also moments of pure joy, feeling the baby move for the first time, seeing Sebastian's face light up when he felt the kicks, preparing a nursery together in colors of soft yellow and green. Lady Victoria, hearing of the pregnancy, sent a cold letter suggesting that Eleanor was being reckless and selfish, risking not only her own life but Sebastian's happiness. Eleanor read it once, felt the familiar sting of judgment, then deliberately burned it in the fireplace. She would not let Victoria's fear and prejudice poison these precious months. The birth, when it came on a cold February morning, was long and difficult. Eleanor labored for 18 hours, and there were moments when even the physicians looked worried. When Sebastian's face was gray with fear as he paced outside the bedroom door, men not being allowed in the birthing room despite his protests. But Eleanor was determined to survive, to meet this child she and Sebastian had created, to prove all the naysayers wrong. When the baby finally emerged with a lusty cry, and the midwife announced, "A healthy boy, my lady." A beautiful, healthy boy. Eleanor burst into tears of relief and joy. They placed the baby in her arms, a red-faced, squalling bundle with a shock of dark hair, and she stared at him in wonder, hardly able to believe this miracle was real. When Sebastian was finally allowed to enter, he stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. Eleanor, exhausted but radiant, cradling their son. He crossed to them slowly, as if afraid that moving too quickly might shatter the moment. When he reached the bed and looked down at his son for the first time, tears streamed down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. My God, Eleanor, you did it. You brought him safely into the world." "We did it," Eleanor corrected gently. "Together, as we do everything." They named him William, after Sebastian's grandfather, and he was christened in the same chapel where his parents had married. The christening was attended by a much larger crowd than the wedding had been. Word had spread of the healthy birth, and suddenly many people who had been skeptical of the match wanted to show their support. Even Lady Victoria attended, though she remained stiff and formal, unable to fully admit she had been wrong. But Uncle George held his great-nephew with tears of joy, and the Duchess of Somerset announced loudly that this was proof that society's rules about appropriate ages were nonsense invented by people with too much time and too little sense. Caroline, now pregnant herself, hugged Eleanor tightly and whispered, "You gave me courage, you know. Watching you refuse to accept society's limitations, insisting on living on your own terms, it made me braver too." Eleanor and Sebastian went on to have two more children, a daughter named Lillian after Sebastian's grandmother, born when Eleanor was 38, and another son, Edmund, born when she was 40. Each birth carried risks. Each was carefully monitored, but each resulted in a healthy child and a mother who survived to hold them. Eleanor never took it for granted, never forgot how lucky she was. But she also never regretted her choice to try, to live fully rather than cautiously. As the years passed, Ashworth Hall filled with life and laughter, children playing in the gardens, racing through the halls, learning to ride in the deer park. Sebastian proved to be a devoted father, nothing like the distant aristocratic fathers of his own generation. He read to his children, played with them, answered their endless questions with patience and interest. And Eleanor found that motherhood at a mature age brought unexpected gifts. She had patience and wisdom that her younger self would have lacked, a deep appreciation for every moment that came from having waited so long and overcome so much to achieve it. One evening, when William was 8, Lillian 6, and Edmund 4, Eleanor stood in the nursery doorway watching Sebastian tell them a bedtime story. His hair was grayer now, and there were more lines on his face, but his eyes still held that warmth and love that had first drawn her to him. The children were entranced, leaning against him, their faces rapt with attention. Later, after the children were asleep, Sebastian found Eleanor in the library, her favorite retreat in the evenings. She was curled in a chair by the fire, a book in her lap, but her mind clearly elsewhere. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Eleanor smiled, reaching for his hand. "I was thinking about that first night at the Worthington ball. When you crossed that crowded room and spoke to me, choosing me out of all the young, beautiful women there. Do you remember?" "I remember everything," Sebastian replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "I remember thinking that you looked like the only real person in a room full of pretty dolls. I remember the intelligence in your eyes, the way you understood exactly what I meant about feeling suffocated. I remember realizing, even in that first conversation, that I had found something precious and rare. Society said I was too old," Eleanor murmured. Too old to marry, too old to be desired, too old to build a life and family. They said I had missed my chance, that I should accept my fate as a spinster and be grateful for whatever scraps of existence I was allowed. And instead, you became a countess, a mother, a woman who has transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her, Sebastian said softly. You have been a better chatelaine of Ashworth than anyone in living memory. You have improved the lives of our tenants, educated their children, brought compassion and intelligence to everything you do. Our children adore you. I adore you. You are, in every way that matters, extraordinary. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. I used to think, she admitted, that my life was over at 34, that I had failed at the most basic expectation for women, that I was worthless. And now, Sebastian prompted gently. Now I know that my life was just beginning, Eleanor replied. That everything before, all the rejections, all the painful years of being overlooked, was simply bringing me to that moment when you would walk across a ballroom and see me. Really see me, not my age or my unmarried status, but me, Eleanor. And I know now that there is no such thing as too late for love, for happiness, for building a meaningful life. That belief is just another way society tries to control women, to make us desperate and compliant. Sebastian leaned forward and kissed her, soft and lingering. You have taught me so much, he said when they parted. About courage, about resilience, about refusing to accept limitations that others try to impose. Before you, I was existing, but not living. Now I am fully alive. And I wake up every morning grateful that you said yes to that impossible proposal in Kensington Gardens. Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, feeling completely at peace. Outside, the winter wind howled around Ashworth Hall, but inside was warmth and love and the life they had built together against all odds and expectations. Years later, when Eleanor was in her 60s and her children were grown, she received a letter from a young woman she did not know. The letter explained that the woman was 32 years old and unmarried, that she had been told repeatedly she was past her prime, that she should give up hope of love and marriage. But then she had heard the story of Eleanor Thorne, Countess of Ashworth, who had married at 34 and built an extraordinary life. Your story gave me courage, the woman wrote. It made me believe that it is not too late for me, that I do not have to settle or give up. Thank you for living your life so boldly. Eleanor showed the letter to Sebastian, now in his 70s but still vigorous, still devoted. Look, she said softly. We changed more than just our own lives. Sebastian read the letter with a smile. Of course we did. How could we not? You showed the world that society's rules are arbitrary, that love and happiness do not have expiration dates. You became the proof that women are not diminished by age but enriched by it. Eleanor carefully folded the letter and placed it in her writing desk. She would reply to the young woman, would encourage her to hold fast to her standards, to wait for love rather than settling for convenience. She would tell her story, not to boast, but to offer hope, because that, she had learned, was the greatest gift of her unconventional love story. Not just her own happiness, but the inspiration it provided to others who had been told they were too old, too particular, too late. Every woman who heard her story and decided to wait for real love rather than accepting what society dictated. Every person who chose courage over fear, hope over resignation. Eleanor stood at the window of Ashworth Hall, looking out over the estate that had become her home, the gardens she had redesigned, the village whose school bore her name. She thought about the girl she had been at 20, hopeful but unwilling to settle. The woman she had been at 34, resigned to loneliness, believing her life was over before it had truly begun. And the woman she was now in her 60s, fulfilled, loved, surrounded by children and grandchildren, having lived a life richer and more meaningful than any fantasy of her youth. It was never too late, she whispered to her reflection in the window glass. It was always exactly the right time. Behind her, Sebastian approached and wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as they looked out together at the deepening twilight. No words were necessary. After decades together, they had long since learned to communicate in the comfortable silence of complete understanding. The story of Eleanor and Sebastian became legend in their county and beyond, not as a scandal or a cautionary tale, but as a romance for the ages. The Earl and the woman they had called too old, who had defied expectations and society's cruel judgments to build a love that lasted a lifetime. Young people in the village would point out Eleanor when she visited the tenants or attended church, whispering to each other, "That is the Countess. She married at 34 when everyone said she was too old. She had 3 children and lived happily ever after." She proved them all wrong. And Eleanor, overhearing these whispers, would smile and think, "Not wrong exactly. Just living on my own terms, in my own time." And that made all the difference. This journey of Eleanor reminds us that it is never too late to find our place in the world, never too late to be truly seen and loved for who we are. If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself in Eleanor's struggles or her victories, leave a comment sharing your experience. Your story matters too. Give that like so more people can find this message of hope in a world that too often tells us we have missed our chance. And subscribe to the channel for more stories that celebrate love in its own time, that remind us that the most beautiful chapters often begin when everyone else has declared the story over. Because each of us, no matter our age, deserves a story where we are the protagonist, not the footnote. Until the next story, remember, you are never too old for new beginnings. The best is yet to come.